What we have seen so far is, in the interest of bringing in incentive compatibility into infrastructure development, we've seen that commercializing infrastructure would be a good step. That would enable us to bring in public-private partnerships. What we will now see are the key implications of public-private partnerships, which I would classify into 8 important implications. The first, and which I believe is the most important and a very good start, is project structuring. Once we structure a project appropriately, then we need to appraise, assess risks, and do the risk management. This aspect, especially of risk assessment and risk management, is new in the context of public-private partnerships. In the earlier regime, when government was the primary developer of infrastructure, while some aspects of structuring or appraisal would have been thought through, the idea of assessing risks and managing risks would just not have been there. This is a new aspect that's come in, especially because we are bringing in a private party and they need to understand the whole idea of risk assessment and risk management. The third key implication is sourcing of funds. Here again, we would be moving away from what would have been the traditional sourcing of funds, which government would have provided primarily through budgetary support. Now, with the private party coming in, many other avenues of sourcing of funds come to play. First, of course, would be the equity that the private party would bring in. Now, because the private party is coming in with equity, it's also possible to source debt funds and a variety of debt funds. All this could be in addition to some amount of funds that the government may provide through budgetary support. Now, while of course sourcing both equity and debt, again there are different sources, funds with different tenors, funds with different risk appetites. So those bring in a major implication for infrastructure development. The next implication, and that's the fourth one, is tendering and bidding. Tendering a project. So a lot of documentation needs to happen. We need to develop documents starting from how would you qualify, or firstly, how would you bring in parties with an expression of interest? Next, how would you qualify them? So usually there is a document called request for quotation, and then once you qualify some of them, they would have to propose, and that's when we have a request for proposal. So based on the proposals, there would be evaluation, and based on the evaluation on certain parameters, one would decide which party actually would qualify or would get the award as the public-private partner or as the private partner in the public-private partnership. So this whole process is tendering and bidding. The fifth implication is again in many ways a very critical aspect for the success of public-private partnerships, and this is the idea of building good concession agreements. And one of the critical elements of a good concession agreement is that it is legally tenable. So we say legally tenable concession agreements. This again is different from how infrastructure development would have happened purely in the government domain. Usually in the government domain, we would have had contractors and there would possibly have been a contractual agreement. But a concession agreement is a lot more than a contractual agreement. In a concession agreement, we also bring in revenue aspects, risk aspects, aspects where, when would government step in. So there are a whole bunch of issues that make a concession agreement acceptable to both the public and the private party and make it legally tenable. The next implication is of project management, because now once the concession agreement is signed, the project is ready to act for execution, and that's when the project management actually happens. The private party, of course, becomes primarily responsible for project management. Of course, the public party or the authority has a role in the project management because many times permissions would be required, and so the public party or the authority will have to stay with the project management process. In fact, after the fifth implication, we can formally call the private party as a concessionaire and the public party as the authority. So the concession agreement is effectively between the authority and the concessionaire. So the concessionaire is the one that does the project management with the support and, if you will, some oversight by the authority. So that is the sixth implication. The next implication is the ownership related issues post project. Now, while we may have a concession agreement for a certain duration, usually a significantly long duration, a duration that's good enough for the concessionaire to get their due returns from the project, but the ownership by the concessionaire need not remain the same. In fact, if we want flexibility and make the project attractive for a variety of bidders to come in, we may provide flexibility for the ownership to change in a time frame lesser than the time frame of the concession period. But of course, the ownership change needs to happen under certain approved conditions, again with the oversight of the authority. And there are many projects where the ownership would have changed at a time frame lesser than the concession period because the original winning bidder did not see the project as something that they would want to stay on as part of their portfolio for the entire duration of the concession period. So post-project ownership becomes an important implication. And finally, as the eighth implication, we need a proper regulatory and dispute resolution framework. The regulatory framework, for example, has to be conscious of various conditions laid out in the concession agreement. Some of the regulatory requirements would have been specified in the concession agreement, but then we have a regulator who would be vested with the responsibility of ensuring that the elements of the concession agreement are actually executed. Sometimes it would run into a dispute. The dispute could be because of non-compliance. The dispute could be due to interpretation. Again, we need a mechanism where the dispute would get resolved. Sometimes the regulator themselves can help resolve the dispute. Sometimes you need another institution because the dispute itself could be with the regulator. And so having a proper regulatory and dispute resolution framework becomes important. So again, to summarize, we have 8 key implications of bringing in private parties through the PPP framework. 1. Project structuring. 2. Appraisal, risk assessment and risk management. 3. Sourcing of funds. 4. Tendering and bidding. 5. Legally tenable concession agreements. 6. Project management. 7. Post-project ownership. And 8. Regulatory and dispute resolution framework. In a way, the first 7 actually follow the project life cycle. In a sense, they are one after the other in a time sequence. But the 8th is something that has to be present right through, because the regulatory and dispute resolution issues could occur any time during the project life cycle.